Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, rating and ranking the conferences. This has become my primary project during each and every off season. I enjoy it. I love to get your feedback as well on the formula and then the results. So before we dive into each Power 5 conference and their results from 2017, I'd like to explain the formula so you understand the numbers that you're going to see in the future videos. Also understand that I'm not necessarily rating and ranking the conferences saying at the conclusion of this conference is the best, they're number 2, they're number 3, they're 4, and they're 5. I am rating and ranking the conferences based on the results of 2017, solely on the Power 5 games non-conference. So I'm not taking into consideration the Group of 5 or the FCS games. And that would be a larger discussion. So, for example, we know that there are a number of teams in the Group of 5 that are better than Power 5 teams. Central Florida would be the outstanding example of that in 2017. And on a yearly basis, we see that out of Boise State, Houston, Navy, other schools in the Group of 5 that are better than the Power 5. So I'm not discounting those results, but it just becomes a more difficult project and a more outstanding project, and there's a lot of more measurements to take into consideration. And certainly, if a Power 5 school loses to a bad Group of 5 or an FCS team, that should be taken into large consideration as a knock against that particular conference. But this, in fact, is a pure system and a pure measurement because we have enclosed it. It's a closed experiment within the Power 5 games. So we know exactly what we're getting when we measure wins and losses. So take that into consideration. A pure experiment, not all-encompassing, all-exhaustive of college football. We could take that on at a future date, but this has worked pretty well. So we seed all the conferences. That's not based on my opinion. That's based on the results from 2017. There will be, and there have been in the past, a number of seedings that I don't personally agree with. I may think the 4 seed in this conference is better than the 2 seed. We see that many times in the SEC when a Florida has won the SEC Eastern Division, and the record speaks to the win in the SEC Eastern Division, but maybe they had a lighter schedule than a 2nd or 3rd place team in the SEC West. But the seedings are the seedings, and I'm not going to impose my opinion on the seedings. I go strictly by the seedings in the conferences based on 2017. So this is not a projection as well toward 2018. This is based on the results of 2017. And again, I'm not strictly rating and ranking the conferences saying this is the best, they're number 2, they're 3, they're 4, they're 5. But this is how well they played in those games against the other conferences. So we seed all the conferences. Okay, why do we need to adjust the seeds? We have to because unfortunately we've got an imbalance of number of teams in the conferences, 14 teams in the SEC, the ACC, and the Big Ten, 12 in the Pac-12, and 10 in the Big 12. Therefore, we've got to adjust the seeds because the seeds aren't comparable. So a 5 seed in the Big 12 with 10 teams, 5 out of 10, is comparable to a 7 seed in the ACC, the SEC, and the Big 10. Think 7 out of 14 is the same as 5 out of 10, but a 5 seed is not the same as a 7 seed. Therefore, I based the seedings on a 14-team league. So I adjusted the seedings in the Pac-12 and in the Big 12 to a 14-team league. So it requires a number of decimal points. The only one that works out perfectly is the 7 versus the 5 because 7 out of 14 is the same as 5 out of 10 is the same as 6 out of 12 in the Pac-12. But other than that, we got decimal points all over the place. Just trust me, the math works. But we had to adjust the seeds. Then we take all the wins and losses. So for example, in the Pac-12 won 9 games against the other 4 conferences. The Pac-12 lost 10 games against the other 4 conferences. So that would tell us on the surface the Pac-12 was pretty marginal in 2017. Not awful, but certainly not great. Pretty marginal, 9 and 10. But that 9 and 10 needs to be placed into context. Was that USC beating Clemson and Auburn and Alabama and Ohio State and Wisconsin and all these really good teams? Or was that the Pac-12 losing against Kansas and Vanderbilt and Ole Miss and Syracuse? Well, we know it's a little bit of both. We have to take the wins into context, and this is how we do it. We grade the wins and the losses. So let's take some extreme examples, but first off, let's take an easy example. If a 1 seed beats another 1 seed in another conference, that's 14 points for the winner of the game for that conference, and that's negative 14 points for the loser of that game and their conference. So for example, in the Rose Bowl, we had Georgia defeating Oklahoma. And let's throw out the decimal points because they're fairly insignificant here. Georgia, the 1 seed in the SEC. Oklahoma, the 1 seed in the Big 12. That's a 1 defeating a 1. Therefore, that's a 14-point win for the SEC. That's a negative 14 points for the Big 12. The reason I use 14 points as the baseline is because we're basing this on a 14 team league. Therefore, I go with 14 points to start. But there are other examples that make it more complicated. Penn State beat Pitt. Well, Penn State's a 3 seed in the Big Ten, and Pitt's like a 10 seed in the ACC. So should they be given a full 14 points as Georgia in the SEC was against Oklahoma in the Big 12? No. So I take the seed difference away from the winner in this case. So Penn State a 3 versus Pitt like a 10. I don't know off the top of my head, but if Pitt was the 10, I take that 7 seed difference and I take it off the 14 points for the Big Ten, and they get awarded 7 points. Thusly, the ACC only takes a 7-point hit for the loss because Pitt, as a 5 and 7 team, a 10 seed out of the ACC, should not be expected to beat one of the better teams in the country, a 3 seed out of the Big Ten in Penn State, so the ACC only takes a 7-point loss. But still, they lost the game, so they need to take a hit for the loss. One of the more egregious examples I can think of going back a few years when Mizzou won the SEC Eastern Division. They were the 2 seed out of the SEC. They lost to a 13 seed Indiana team out of the Big Ten. So they took a huge hit to the SEC for losing that game. The 14 points plus all those seeding differences added into the equation for like a negative 26 for the SEC and a plus 26 for the Big Ten in that case. You're not going to see a whole lot of that because this may be a surprise to you, but as I go through all the games played against each other, and I'll give you the grand total number of games, I know it's been around 55 or 60 in the past in which the Power 5 have played against each other non-conference. There's not a whole lot of examples of bad teams beating good teams. Vanderbilt is the 12 seed in the SEC, defeating Kansas State, a team that went 8 and 5 in the Big 12. That's one example. Therefore, it's a really good win for the SEC with a lot of points attached to it and a bad loss for the Big 12 in that case. All right, so then we measure the quality of the wins and the losses. So we grade them out. So a win in that perfect case scenario of a like seed playing a like seed is a 14-point win for the conference that won, a negative 14 points for the conference that lost. So I take the 14 points. But in other cases, it might be 15.7 for the winner and negative 15.7 for the loser. Or it might be plus 11.2 for the winner, negative 11.2 for the loser. So I take the quality of the wins and losses, and it's attached to the winning percentage. So the winning percentage factors into the seeding, so I don't include that, but I will reflect that on the board, on the whiteboard, the winning percentage. So for example, this was very impressive last year out of the SEC. The SEC won 14 games against the other 4 power conferences. Those 14 teams that won those games, won all 14 games for the SEC, had a winning percentage inside the SEC of 59%. They defeated 14 teams out of the other 4 leagues that had a winning percentage of 65% in their league. Those are comparable measurements to take that mean something. If you're taking 14 games in which your league won all 14 games, and those teams only won 59% in your league, that means they're pretty marginal in your league, but they went out and they won all 14 games against teams that were able to win 65% of their games in their leagues. So the winning percentage is an interesting factor that is factored again into the seeding, so it really plays into it, but I reflected on the whiteboard just to give you some more information to go by. So we will start with the Pac-12. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Certainly I invite and welcome your thoughts, your questions, and your suggestions right here on Mark Rogers TV.